perspective. So I'm here, although I'm a scholar, I'm kind of here in the context of being an artist, is how I'm trying to explain and go through what I experience when making music, when playing with rhythm, when playing with time. So I'll be talking about those things as a part of our experience. I'll also try and outline some of the ways in which we think aesthetically about these things when we're making them. How do we conceptualize what we want rhythm and time to be in our music? Hopefully throughout what I say, this will engage and interact with all the varied areas that are part of this research center, and prompt questions about collaboration, digitization, and so on and so forth. Throughout the talk, I'll be showing quite a lot of music to try and make various points at cross sections of what we do. And hopefully some of these examples can prompt other areas of thought as well. As a caveat, maybe, as this is kind of me talking about artistic work rather than a research project in itself, I kind of apologize I don't have conclusions. I've got examples and I've got ideas, I can give you those, but conclusions are kind of more what you are able maybe to take from it and to go, I could apply that here or here. So that's what I'm going to do. So the Nighthawks project, which is now a decade in the making, it's me, another person called Mark Slater. We came up with this project a decade ago because we both shared questions that we wanted to find answers for in a musical project. So as outlined, I've done a lot of production work where often the goal is I'm going to work with this band ensemble artist to make them sound as good as I can. And in my head, I've probably already got what we might call a mix model or a mix template of how I think that thing should sound. And so after doing that for quite a long time, and in quite a lot of instances, there can be kind of a creative unfulfillment with that process, where it would be really nice to start a process where you didn't know how it would sound at the end. And so that idea of not knowing and not having an aesthetic aim in itself was part of what led to this project. And so the questions were, what happens if we remove options? So for me as a music producer, and if some of you produce music with electronics, you'll know the moment where you've got a keyboard and a set of presets and you're going through playing it, next preset, playing it, and maybe doing that 50 times, 100 times. That is my creative worst nightmare. I'm just looking for something that I think exists, but I'm just gonna have to wait to find it. So we wanted to take away options. So there's been a lot written about the ubiquity of music technologies and about the fact that everyone has access to the same tools. So sample libraries, synthesizer presets, etc. So we wanted to remove options was part of the start. We then took that further of like, what if the only option actually is really limited? Rather than just getting rid of presets, what if we go even more narrow in our focus of what we work with? And then lastly, because we are both producers, Mark's kind of a composer, producer, we wanted to create a project where we are able to respond to things rather than create things from nothing. Because that's what producers often do. And that's what really excites us, is hearing someone create something and then us say, what could we interpret or mediate that as? So those were our start point questions. So to do that, like all projects and all bands should, we had a manifesto. You're not a real band if you don't have a manifesto. No one agrees with me on that. We created a manifesto, and this is a book by Alex Danchev called 100 Artist Manifestos, which I always find really inspiring to think about how people conceptualize what they want to do, and more importantly, sometimes what they don't want to do. I love it. It goes from visual arts across a range of settings, and I always find it really inspiring. But the thing that I took from it was the idea that manifestos are there to push forward or to acknowledge a change in process or product. So at this point where we were maybe say creatively stagnant, manifesto is a way to change that. And we wanted to create and embrace limitation. So we wanted to create a form of resistance in the medium and to make it so that there were things that we couldn't do. So in music production, if you practice that, you know that you can do almost anything with what you have available to you. The tools are so functional and so amazingly developed that you could create a really good sounding track really quickly by dragging and dropping and using sequences, etc. And we wanted to make it, in effect, for some reason, much, much harder for ourselves to be able to do that. So we didn't know what would make. This kind of thing has been done a lot, and I've got a few examples of different forms of manifesto and restriction. Igor Stravinsky, in his book, The Poetics of Music, said that if nothing offers me any resistance, then any effort is inconceivable. and I cannot use anything as a basis, and consequently every undertaking becomes futile. I really loved this quote when I first read it, because it's so, as a musician, it's so counterproductive to remove possibilities, to say I don't want all these wonderful things, I'd rather not have them. But reading something like that, and there's way more detail from Stravinsky in this passage, he goes on to kind of talk about how the fewer options he has, the more free he feels, which is a very counterproductive mindset you can only get to from trying, I think. Close to here, the Dogma 95 film movement in Denmark, set up by 4 Danish directors, saying that we want to do things differently to where things are. So they set out a set of rules of things they could and couldn't do in order to kind of create its own aesthetic as a rejection to what was there, or as a challenge to it. So in this, there was a reaction to filmmaking, and they said instead they were going to have to use things like cameras had to be handheld, things had to be shot on location, sound was from location, and the removal of non-diegetic sound. They couldn't have overdubbed audio. As a way to go, this is where normative practice has got to, and we want to do something different. Still in this area-ish, compared to me, the new Nordic Food Manifesto is another example of a reaction to normative practice, and go, we don't want to do the things we've been doing in terms of importing ingredients. And this was an agreement between chefs from the Nordic region to go, we're going to use ingredients from where we live. And we're going to find new technologies, new tools, techniques, and ingredients in order to do something new and different, which, if we've got any gastronomic people in, know how successful that has been to the Nordic area, particularly with Noma winning Restaurant of the Year 4 years in a row, etc. The idea for us that's inspirational from it is the bravery of going of a rejection and leading towards new things, creativity, innovation through different technologies. So this brings us to the manifesto and the Nightports project. So I'll read our manifesto and then break it down a little bit. So Nightports is based on a simple but unbreakable rule of restriction. Only sounds produced by the featured musician can be used, nothing else. These sounds can be transformed, distorted, translated, processed and reprocessed, stretched, cut, ordered and reordered without limitation. So we aren't limiting at all our tools of mediation. We can do anything to the sound we want. We just can't use another sound source. So we can't record a drummer and then add a synthesizer to it. We can only use those sounds. Because Nightports is about amplifying the characteristic of the musician, celebrating what's particular about them, finding sounds that no one else can make, constructing the complex sonic weave that, however radical, the transformation still bears the watermarks of its origin. So we didn't want this to be a project based on abstraction, so recording someone as a stimulus and then taking it away from them. We instead wanted it to, kind of like the Food Manifesto, amplify what was already there, to make a case for the identity of who we're working with or where we're working with, and adding ourselves into the mix. Because at its core, we are interested in something real. So we are interested in illusion and interpretation and exploration, but we want something real at the center of it, because without it, it would not be this project. It could be other electronic music. So we want a person and their own sense of style to exist within the manifesto and not just us. We want to know if there's any meaning in using specific sound source and players. In relation to the title of the talk, the Did I Play That? Is because when we go through this process and we take someone's performance and we abstract it and we change it and we remanipulate it and we bring it back, often there's this sense of shifting ownership of the material. So in a recent example, we were having a rehearsal for a gig that night, and we were playing the featured musician, the track they'd made, and they were pretty convincingly were sure it was someone else's track. Every sound on this is from your instrument. And so maybe we didn't meet the manifesto demands there, but it's this idea that we can create something that never existed. So everything I show you today, where it sounds like a performance, is challenging the idea of a coherent performance, because it's always manipulated or mediated. So we've got this visual from our wonderful designer called Ollie Bentley at Split, and he tried to make a visual metaphor representation of what this project is, which I thought might illustrate it. And it's the idea of taking a thing, chopping it, fragmenting it, reordering it to still be that thing, but with a different sense of identity to it, where it still exists as a noticeable trace of its origin, but it's been reformed to have something new. And as a result, it's kind of slightly broken. It's slightly unorthodox. So our working process is largely to identify something to work with, whether it's a person or a place. We then capture it. So with a musician, we'll book a day in a recording studio and just work with them and get as much data and ideas and different sounds as we can at other instrument. If it's a place, we'll go and see what sounds exist in that place and use as many different techniques we can think of to capture this, because once we've got that capture part done, we can't add anything else. We then go through the process of fragmenting. So we take the improvisations, we pull them apart, we take sounds, we rip those into different pieces in order to then rebuild and recreate. So in trying to think of things to reflect on for this talk, we kind of get to this idea in the way we think about our work as this tripartite of different elements. That is how it feels to us. We have the human element, or the idea of us and the person we're working with. We also then have the technology element, so the things the manifesto allows us to do, whether it's in a laptop, through microphones, or through plugins, or through mediation techniques. And we also have the music, both the music that the person brings, that they improvise, that they play, their own sense of style, but also the music we create. And one of the things about the rules that we found interesting in this project was how what effectively we're doing each time is completely changing the musical node. We're left with the same technologies that we have. We're left with us, so we're changing certain bits of the node. So we got excited about the idea that over time, surely what's left between these different projects is our own aesthetic. If we've changed the musician, changed the instrument, changed the sound, the bit that's left over is hopefully going to be us. So I thought I would show you some examples of how this sounds, because there are so many ways that you could take the same manifesto based on the aesthetic that you have and what you want to make. So I'll show you a bit of our effectively discography across time. The first thing we did was with a vocalist named Emily Lynn, and we made this album called Depart, and this was very much us learning how to play with these rules of a manifesto and how to make Emily's voice be a bass, how to make it be a kick drum, be a snare drum, and all of these different things. So learning the technological tools and finding the aesthetic. So I'll play you a bit of this track called Skywide.
We're okay. We're going to be okay. No, you need it said. Just enjoy it this way. See all the lights beneath our feet. Love is laid out to sea.
Really lovely to have a fade out function here. Very much enjoying that, everyone. So we did that one with Emily, which was great. We learned so much. And we then decided to change the project. So we went from working with a musician and with a human to working with a place. And we got invited by a brewery in Leeds called Anthology to make a sound installation or a performance or whatever you will, based on a brewing of a beer called Night Porter. And because of the pun alone, I had to do that, because if a pun looks you in the mouth, something in that gift horse saying. So we did this, and we basically had to learn loads of different techniques and find different ways to create things. So different ways to capture rhythm, different ways to capture harmony and melody. So we have concept mics on the brewery vessels. We had hydrophones to capture the sound of things moving. One of the think it's called a spar jar. And in fact, this has been streamed and they'll watch it. I'm not comfortable saying spar jar. It had a squeak on it, which gave us pitch. And those different parts of mechanics gave us ways we could map rhythm to mechanical sounds that were in there. So we went about creating a 20-minute set based on the process of brewing. So each track was kind of from that tank or from that process. So no, I was about to confidently say the different parts of brewing, and I've backed out of it now. The different processes of brewing. So I'll play you 2 little excerpts from that so you can see the difference. And this was us, I guess, going further than the Emily example, because we were putting ourselves in it. There was no music at the start. Here's an example. Great. So we went from there, and we, at that point, figured out that we really liked having music to work with, because this was really hard to do. And it was really, there wasn't a lot of push and pull with something. It was creating something from things at an atomic level. So we then started to work with improvising musicians, because they have so many ideas, they have so many things they can get out, that to then be able, for us to be able to then take that and mediate it through our process seemed really logical. So we took the rules and just shifted the musician part. So I want to play an example by Matthew later in a case study, but this is just to kind of go through the discography. We worked with a jazz pianist in the UK called Matthew Bourne, who is an incredible musician, and if you have never heard of, I couldn't recommend Googling him more. He's got an amazing range of output, from synthesizer work to improvised piano to a lot of prepared piano work. I think somewhere on YouTube is still a video of him doing a performance while smashing a piano with a sledgehammer, like smashing it a bit, playing it, interacting with it differently, smashing it a bit. So we did a day recording with him in a piano shop where there were loads of 3 stories of an old mill of pianos, and he would just find a broken piano and start playing with it and improvising. But I'll play you some more of him later in detail. We then went back to another place, and we decided to, we really wanted to do stuff with bells because of how amazing they sound. So we went and did loads of field recordings in this temple in Thailand called Wat Chedai Luang, and we made a 3-track EP. This was just at the start of lockdown. Something to do, isn't it? And we tried to create a different kind of soundscape. So we wanted to partly represent the place, represent the sounds of that place, but also just this idea of abstracting the feeling of the place, or the essence of it, through the kind of subjectivities. So I'll play you a little bit of Stupa. enjoy my fade out function yet again. So we tried to obviously do different things with that, different aesthetic states, different ways of thinking about that place through music. The next big project we did was with a drummer, an amazing drummer. If you've ever heard of the band The Comet Is Coming, their drummer is called Betamax, and he is amazing. He was recommended to us by a label, the Leaf label, as saying that he basically achieved propulsion, was I think the wording they used, that he just constantly moves forward. And if you've ever seen that band, The Comet Is Coming, they just keep moving forward. And the energy in the drums is so unbelievable. So this was another one where we had a day improvising, and we got so much drums in one day. And we left after one day recording going, there's a full album here. Compared to the other projects, really different. We had effectively hours of drums, and then a question of what to do with that, because not everyone, and this is a shock to some people, but not everyone wants to listen to hours of just drums, which it's tough. So we went about making this album for and with Betamax, where we took the drums, reprocessed them, and in this one, different to the others, we tried to find a sonic world for the drums, to position them in something that he's never heard, he's never existed, and put it in that. And to go back to the title of the talk again, the Did I Play That? When we first sent this back, the reaction from Betamax was, I don't know what's happened, because these things that sound like an ensemble, sound performed, were just his ideas coming out. So it's kind of that strange disjunct of you collaborate for a bit, you take it away, and then they get something back that's a completely different world. So this is a bit of Betamax and Spark. Okay. Most recently, the project we've been involved with is a collaboration, effectively, with a clock tower. So in the city of Hull, in the northeast of England, there's a Minster building with a huge clock tower with an amazing set of bells that ring out in the city and have done for hundreds of years. And we decided to capture this place, and then we wanted it to be based in the place as well. So like the brewery where we performed it for that, we wanted something that told a bit of the story of the Minster itself and the idea of its significance as a time marker in the city for so long. So we took a lot of equipment up the spiral staircase to the top of the Hull Minster, which I don't think anyone should have to do. And we recorded all the sounds that came from it to compose a piece around the clocks. So in the idea we had at the start was that on the hour, the clocks would ring. We would then live capture those. We would process them and start turning that into a 15-minute cycle of music. We would then make room at 1/4 for the bells to return for the 1/4 chime, and then do more movements to finish at 1/2. So kind of interacting with the bell tower and the space. We performed this last Friday for the Hull Spring Festival in the Minster, where we did several performances through the night and people could come in and out. So we did on the hour every hour for 4 hours, which involves quite a lot of technology, as you may be able to see in the lower segment. And something we tried new for this project was to work with Matthew Barnard in the middle, who is a spatialization expert. So we had, he'll correct me, but I think we had 26 speakers set up around the church. So we had an inner kind of sanctum where the sound was pretty concentrated in the middle, but then also there were pairs of speakers all the way down the nave that Matt could diffuse to create these amazing immersive effects. And each time, even though we performed it 4 times and had 2 sound checks, I still got caught off guard when a huge clock sound emerged from behind me and it felt like I was about to get crushed. But he could kind of throw the sound around and make these amazing experiences. So I've got a little trailer, like a minute, showing a video we did in August to show what this project would be. That. As it's based around time, most of the beats you hear are clock hands. It seems pretty Ritmo-esque. I think it's hard to find something more Ritmo-esque. So I'll take you a little bit through working practice. So as an example of time and how creative and productive time is spent, this is an example breakdown of the drum album, just to show you the typical process. So our recording session was 6.5 hours. So I spent 6.5 hours with Betamax, and that was it then for a year and a half, which is very strange. We ended up on that day with 1 hour and 41 minutes of audio. So he improvised for 1 hour and 41, which we then took home. It was then 16 months and a day before we had made that into the album. We'd finished that work, and it ended up being 40 minutes or 11 tracks, which I started this as like, that'd be a really nice way to see this project. And then after I did it, I felt really like this is a time-intensive project, 16 months. But basically what we get from this data is that it's about deletion, and it's about refinement, that we ended up getting rid of 1 hour. We ended up finding more things to be repeated. And it tells the story of kind of compositional time. So as an example, this is the logic set we were given from the day. So if anyone doesn't know digital audio workstations, the horizontal is time axis, vertical is the different tracks. So this is all we got from that session. It's 4 different improvisations. The middle one is in 3 units because there was the main drum improvisation, there was a percussion improvisation, and then a pedal mess around at the same time. So we got this 1 hour and 41 of music that contained all of the markers for the album. And one of the ways in thinking about this talk that I realized that we think about time is in almost potential time or compositional time, or the way in which time affords certain output. So during this recording session, I'm sat there with a notepad, and each idea that emerges, I'm thinking about the potential of that idea for a structure, thinking that would be amazing as a loop. I can repeat that probably for 2 minutes before I'd need to change it. And all these different ways that I can pre-plan what I will do with this time. And another way this relates to time and output is the fact that because we're on a label that releases vinyl, I'm also thinking about time as an affordance of the technology I'm using. So vinyl typically is wanted between 35 and 45 minutes. So I'm thinking about this at the time of performance and arrival in relation to how this will break down into tracks. And so there's kind of this future or a pro-tension looking forward. Which brings me on to something I wanted to touch on in order to talk about it in my case studies. But I think a lot of people here talk about this probably quite a lot, so I won't dwell on it. But for anyone that doesn't know or doesn't think much about affordances and what they do, affordances is the idea from James Gibson from the 60s and 70s where he says, due to interactions between specific properties of the object and the needs and capabilities of a human perceiver, a chair affords sitting whilst a cup affords drinking. In terms of music, different musical instruments afford different things. A guitar, for instance, affords 6 notes to be played at the same time, whereas a violin affords 4. Those kind of ideas of what things give the user or offer or afford the user. The use of our manifesto to pick one instrument at a time makes us reckon with the affordances of each instrument in quite an active way. We have to think quite creatively about what we can get out of each thing. We have to push beyond the path of least resistance. James Mooney, in 2010, developed his paper called The Spectrum of Affordances, and how that when you pick a framework, whether it's an instrument or a technology, you are engaging with that thing on a spectrum of affordances, from things that are really easy to achieve to things that are impossible. So he says, thus the notion of affordance can be expanded by considering the relative ease or difficulty with which a given affordance can be actioned within a given framework. The result is a spectrum of affordance particular to that framework. So the example I've chosen here, with a human voice, it's quite easy to record and deploy spoken words. It's harder for someone to sing well, to be trained and to execute a well-sung performance. It's impossible to create a polyphonic piano texture from a human voice. What's interesting about this and the idea of affordances in relation to us is how this interacts with technology. So it's very difficult for the human voice to do things as you go higher, but with technology, you can get closer. You can push higher and higher up. And the way in which technologies have changed, even whilst we've been doing this project across a decade, is incredible. The shifts in granular synthesis and the way things are evolving to make things that were previously, or 10 years ago, impossible for us, are now becoming more available. So the way in which, and this looks awful, and I apologize, the way in which we see our projects existing is kind of in that tripartite idea of what we brought before, that we have technological affordances in terms of the technologies we have access to that allow us to interact with sound in a certain type of way. When on our first album, the Emily album, we did that intentionally just with the things that came with Logic Pro X at the time. We only used things that were allowed in that, so as not to get kind of distracted. As we've gone over 10 years, we've gotten more and more technological tools, like that Minster set, for instance, is not possible with only things inside Logic. You need to find new tools, new technologies, because they afford us new actions. In the middle, in our practice, we have the musical object, or the sounding object, which affords us outcomes. So the Minster bells afforded us a certain type of frequency capture. It afforded us a certain type of envelope. With Matt playing piano, Matthew Bourne, he afforded us amazing harmonies that we wouldn't have thought of, and those kind of materials that we are given. And then on the last, on the right-hand side, is our own affordances from our imagination, our ability, our knowledge, and our skill, and also our kind of musical autobiographies, the things we've heard that can inspire us. So between these three, we kind of get this idea of each project shifts, some nodes remain the same, but it's always this interaction between this nexus coming together to create this moment of process. So from that, and the idea of what things afford, I thought I'd talk for a few moments about timbre affecting groove. So because of these different outputs, I've got many different sample sets of grooves and many different ways of hearing them. So I thought I'd just go through a few to highlight how we've composed things in relation to the sounds we have access to. In other words, how the timbre we have access to affords certain things within the rhythms and the groups. So the first example is vocals, where the things that sum this kind of sound up is the lack of low frequency energy. Making a kick drum out of a vocal without extra plugins beyond Logic is really difficult. To make a sound that has a convincing attack of a kick drum is really difficult from a voice. So as a result, the groove has a lot of mouth shape and timbres as kind of subdivision parts. And so the aesthetic became more about adding and more about magnifying what was there and filling the space rather than creating this huge sound. So this is voice groove. my own fade out for that one. Thanks. By contrast, piano groove, we have a lot of low end energy in a piano. You can create loads of energy from it, but we have a lack of fast attack. We have a lot of access to mechanisms in the piano. You can hit a lot of things in the frame to create these amazing sounds. So as a result, our spectral palette was much more diverse than with the vocal sounds. So that sounds like this. And then the last example I'll show is the bells in the Minster. So the clock hands, so this was the main clock mechanism that powers the bells, and it sounds huge. It sounds amazing when you get microphones right in there and capture what that sounds like. So the sound that I constantly thought was going to fall and crush on me was a tiny sound from in there, but magnified sounds absolutely massive. Mechanical sounds, but also then in this project, because of the space, reverb was allowed. Because it sounds amazing, and the idea of being in that space with loads of reverb changes the kind of groove you might want to make. The groove for vocals with loads of reverb would obviously be lost and washed out and would be a completely different aesthetic. But from this one, the context and the sounds themselves afforded bigness. So from the idea of groove making and the idea of how we go about creating instruments, we kind of reflected and realized this model that the way in which we change the time or the temporality of something is such a big part of what we do, and that we have three fundamental options. We can preserve something as it is, so the sound of a bell, the sound of a double bass improvisation, or we can go either way in terms of time. We can fragment it, we can make it small and tiny, like every beat you just heard was a fragmented version of something else. Or we can extend it. I've put granulation there as an example, but there are many technologies that can do this in order to stretch the material out. So when we're making harmony, when we're making textures, it's extension, and then when we're glitching, it's fragmentation. So to kind of put this into practice, I thought I'd show a couple of case studies, particular to things that may be of concern or interest to RITMO. The first is about constructing groove. I thought I'd use a track from Matthew's piano album, his prepared piano album called White Shirted, to show a little bit about how we went about groove and the aesthetic ideals behind it. This track was recorded to a click, which is slightly rare for us. Matt had a click track in his headphones and just improvised, as he tends to do. The really great thing about Matt, and I hope he does watch this, is that he will, because he's built for improvisation, he will not repeat something. So if you miss the take and go, can you just do that bit again? No. Because the moment he does that, he's not doing his own thing. So good and bad when you're making an album. You just have to keep record on. So this is a track called White Shirted. He improvised it and then we added stuff to it. So I'll play a bit of it and then I'll talk you through our thinking for it and then show you a bit of the logic file. I'll stop there. Obviously, that is complete chaos, and I've never played that to songwriting students at Leeds Conservatoire because they would not know what I am anymore. So that was in response to improvisation, and what we wanted to do with that track was integrate with Matt. So he played those single lines that you could hear with his right hand, and we wanted technology to kind of go into that weave and to make it something different to just what was there. So we wanted technology to become part of the performance. So our aim didn't achieve it. Our aim was to make sense of the chaos, to find a way for rhythm, groove, and for timbre to slightly bring some sense of order to what Matt did. I think we may have done the opposite in some ways. We have this idea of reality of illusion or opaque mediation, and the idea of making something that is a fully rounded artificial construct. This does not exist in any form of real world. It is instead a complete construction of the digital audio workstation. So within it, you get the idea of time stretching all over the shop. The piano is manipulated, and one of the things we wanted to achieve was that no one would be sure of what's real or what's not. And instead, it's the mood that takes over, rather than us trying to work out what's the performance, what's not the performance. So one of the things we did for this, to make order of it, because it's a very complex musical material to deal with, and this sounds like an admission of guilt, but we just lined up our transients for kicks with what Matt's was doing. So when there was a large transient or waveform from his performance, we experimented with just putting a kick there, and then on the next one, we put a snare. So in a way, Matthew was building his own beat, which within the Nightports project fits perfectly because we're doing what he would do. So I'll show you that in a moment. We then use time stretching to pull things apart to create rhythms that we could never think of. Such a big thing of what we do is trying to get ourselves out of the equation and let accidents or mistakes happen, things that we couldn't plan. So just by time stretching a snare, we were able to create new rhythms from the sound of that becoming manipulated that we couldn't plan ourselves. So I'm going to come out of this for a moment, if this doesn't break, just to show you the Logic version of this. That's going to be good. Yeah, going to be good. So at the very top, again, we're in the DAW setting, so we have time, instruments. So at the very top, we have the piano already manipulated. So this is what the material that we're working with is. So those sounds are a result of the preparation that Matt's done. So he's already affecting his sounds himself. And then you can see down here, it's not laziness. We've just mapped to him by hand. So where there's a transient that makes sense, we've put our samples. We've followed this along. As the track goes through, we do more and more manipulation, which you can kind of see here. Each one of these is a form of chopped manipulation of that part to create new rhythms and new parts. So I'll play a little bit whilst you can see it, because it takes on a slightly different form and you can see the visuals. So that example there, this piece, process snare, is an example of pulling and pulling apart so you get a new rhythm out of what was there. So you create those new transients from the tail end or the release of the sound to create this. There's a lot that I could talk about with that track because it's a lot, but I just wanted to share some key moments from it. So the second thing I thought I'd show you is about microtiming and performance editing. And it's a very different example, hopefully. So this was from the double bass album with a musician called Tom Herbert, who's an incredible double bass player and big on the UK jazz scene. And we did an album with him where we wanted to just do double bass. And we recorded him for a day, same as the others. And we did lots of different things. We went from having a bit where he'd just play along. There was a bit where he had his water bottle and was just messing around for half an hour. And then the bit that this example comes from was the idea of a loose chord sequence. And then he was going to improvise around it. So what he did without a click, thanks again for that, he just started playing this quaver pattern for about 3 minutes, improvising the quaver pattern. And then he did another take of that same thing to create the harmony beneath it. and ended up with 3 core takes. And that ended up being such a, at the time, such a nice moment of sound. Like, we were all absolutely loving this sound. We decided to run with it, and he improvised over the top. So we had this full thing, but it was not to click. So it's just almost like a tape recorder version of overdubs. So this is what it sounded like at that point. So that sounds lovely, and I really hope that in this example, it doesn't involve anyone ruining how nice that sounds. So what we did with that track is we beat mapped it. For anyone that doesn't know beat mapping, it's when you create a tempo grid in your DAW to facilitate the performance that was given. So in that track, we can match it to Tom's tempo. So we aren't changing the audio, we're just changing the grid so that it fits a normal DAW structure. So it involves changing the tempo every bar also. So this is an example of beat mapping at the top, where you can see the tempo changing consistently throughout to match Tom's performance. I don't want to come off like a victim, but normally when you've got a drum beat, you can just beat map the kick on beat 1 and it will do it for you. But when you've got quavers and a double bass, you can't do that. So you've got to do it by hand. So we did that and we left it the same. We sent it to Tom in the way you just heard it. And he came back to us going, I absolutely love this. This is how I've always heard myself want to be. So it's amazing I've heard it. And we thought, okay, we've got the green light, so we'll work on this track. And then we became, inverted commas, producers and thought, these aren't all on the lines though. So we'll probably just make sure that now we've got it beat mapped, we'll quantize. So the lines down here, that are all of these white lines, are us manually putting each quaver into time in those bars. So the bar structure tempo remained the same, but the inner structure of each bar, the inner rhythmic structure, became bang on. And all 3 takes became unified. Now, you're all RITMO, you know what happened. I didn't know what was going to happen. So we did it, and obviously our aesthetic aim was, let's put it in time, let's follow this. When you see something off the grid as a producer, I kind of get a little flinch in me. So let's move it in. We sent it back to Tom without really reflecting on it. Just did it, here's a new version. So I'll play you the version that came out. So you've only heard that once. I know it very well, and hearing the start of that makes me feel a bit physically ill each time, because all of the sway of Tom has gone, all of the bits in the middle of bars where he slows and comes back has gone, and the sound of the bass has changed, because there are now 3 basses on each hit, and it kind of sounds like a horrible attempt at punk rock by a double bass player, rather than the first one, which is kind of like almost like a wave. This is a zoomed in view of just our attempts at quantizing, of doing all of these beats, cut them up, which took quite a long time and then just had to be deleted. Don't worry about it though. I will do a big shout out to the undo and alternative function in DAWs, which really good stuff. So in this one, we had spent, I think, about a month doing this, and then just had the moment of going, probably just going to pop back to stage 1. So the thing on the album is actually just what we sent to Tom after the first day. I'm over it. So thought about it as we got negative feedback. Tom couldn't also say why, which was really interesting. He said it's just wrong. I don't know what you've done, but it's wrong. And so we had to reflect on that. He said it was deeply wrong. And in this example, we had that technology afforded humanness via the fact we could beat map it. We could create a tempo grid and then create sounds around it that were programmed in time. But it also offered us the temptation of the removal of humanness via this quantization, which sometimes is completely necessary. In this example, was a really bad moment of production call for us. And we got the strange outcome of it, which was this tonal shift, and that the previous flamming of the bass and the pizzicato hitting the wood sounded really smooth and gentle, became suddenly more aggressive and abrupt. So I'll get towards a conclusion. What I've hopefully done or tried to show across this work is the idea of limitation as an aesthetic choice, and the idea of taking away options as leading to new outcomes with some different examples of how and why. And I'm still into this idea of forcing resistance within the creative process. One of the things I've hopefully done by the tripartite and some of the examples is bringing in to focus that shift between technology, the music, and the musician, and those interconnected but ever shifting nodes that rotate. I've loosely and quickly brought up the role of affordances as a way to understand this, because it's something that within our process is so profound that when we're trying to conceptualize what something will be, we don't yet know how far we can take that material or what that material will afford us along the creative process. And then lastly, the idea that new technology is making more of these radical sonic transformations and temporal transformations easier to achieve. So 10 years ago, for us, making that album with the vocalist was a really big technical achievement, and we felt really proud of the outcome. Now, with the technologies we have access to, that's a lot easier to do. So do the rules still make enough of a challenge or an aesthetic point? So it questions where we go next with it and kind of why, because one of the things that we're interested in within this is, does it matter where it comes from? Does the fact that all of these sounds came from a double bass affect how someone perceives the sound of that album or its value, etc.? Some sources and a thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was an absolutely brilliant and fascinating talk. And it was very RITMO-esque, I must just say. so I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions and comments. Fantastic. And if I can just dive in with the first one, as I sometimes do. Would you mind going back to the slide about the nexus of affordances?
Yes.
So something that struck me when you showed that, I'm just wondering.
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it strikes me that with what you're proposing with this amazing work is actually that there's a bit more of a dynamic relationship between the creative process, so that the arrows should in a way be double arrows. So I thought this is not just going a one way. It's not just a one way thing. It's surely also the other way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And even between little bits here and there. So where obviously the music is captured by the technology and played on the technologies. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Great. Oh, Keith.
I'm really excited about this. This is why
okay. No pressure. Let's see what I can do, what this affords me.
Thanks. So a couple of questions. So one, the manifesto that you had reminded me a lot. Seemed very reminiscent of music concrete. So I wondered what you saw as the relation between what you're doing and those ideas. The other part, which relates to affordances as well, it strikes me that part of what you're doing is blurring the boundary between recording and music reproduction and actually synthesis, because some of the affordances you're picking up on are like affordances of sounds, of certain sounds, and then using that almost like a kind of with the technology, but to synthesize completely new sounds. And that in the drum piece, which I enjoyed very much, that seemed very obvious, because some of those sounds, I mean, it's hard to know how you created those, but they certainly didn't sound like drums. So yeah, I mean, I just wondered if that was deliberate, and if that's doing this has changed the way you think about the difference between kind of recording and synthesis, whether that's a kind of spectrum of possibilities there.
Yeah, that's a really Really nice question. The music concrete one for the first one is yes, absolutely. The thing I didn't preface, because I don't always, basically we still wanted it to sound like popular music. Not to kind of place any kind of value judgments, but my background is in popular music. I love the sound of a lot of electronic music, and we kind of wanted to use the rules to inhabit that space. So I really like a lot of electroacoustic music, for instance, but it's not something I've been drawn towards making because it wouldn't be kind of authentic to what I like. So we wanted to use those rules, and which means necessarily borrowing a lot of technologies from electroacoustic and sonic arts, and using Max MSP a bit, not much, in order to create those outcomes, but to use them in the service of something that could, our own ambition was to use in a popular music sphere. For the synthesis part, yeah, there are points where the manifesto has been tested, and one of us in the partnership is very much, we need to stick to the rules, and the other one is sometimes a bit more willing to. So we've had even the discussion about convolution reverb, which if anyone doesn't know, it's where you can record the sound of a place and then put your sound through that place. And we've had to have the moments catching ourselves discussing, like, is that breaking the rules? Because we're adding the sonics of that place, so we don't use that anymore. But the question about synthesis is sometimes really important, because if you've got an easy way to create a tone, if anyone's ever tried, is to take a tiny part of a waveform and oscillate it effectively. And at that point, your question is so accurate that it's synthesizing. And you can create a very similar sound from most sound sources by just taking a small enough chunk. So we've been conscious of that, and once we realized within the vocal track and then onto the anthology brewing thing that some of the sounds were getting a bit familiar, we started to use other technologies to try and do it. So in that in the drum example, there is quite a lot of sampling, so taking moments and stretching them out. The fact that we were able to capture max bowing on a cymbal meant we could get pitch, and that gave us the framework to then create instruments, sampled instruments from. Then more recently, we've used a program called Cycles, which is absolutely amazing. It's one of those programs that's made us go, do we need to do this anymore? Because it's unbelievable. If you check out a demo of it, you could put in one chord, and within 10 minutes, you've created this immersive world. It's unbelievable, but all from that sample. I hope that answers your question. Hi. It's not official without the ball.
I forgot our friend. Thank you so much. Great talk and great examples, really. I had just one small question and another one that's perhaps a bit bigger.
Mm-hmm.
The first, because I kind of was a bit surprised when you described the piano groove as that it lacked fast attacks, because piano is a fast attack instrument. But
Yeah.
I guess that's because he used prepared piano, so he had kind of dampened the attacks.
Yeah, obviously, it's the fast attack instrument, but being able to transfer, so say the low end hits to a kick drum, we're taking out the tone. Just couldn't. We never got it through whatever we were doing at the time. We never got it to sound enough like a percussive aspect when it was an actual tuned note. We tried different things, so it ended up being pitch shifted version of other things to get down there with a fast attack.
Yeah, because the piano groove sounded a bit like everything was dampened in a way. Yeah. So, yeah, but that was the bigger question, I guess. You said when you presented the manifesto that you wanted it to be real.
Yeah.
But what do you mean by real in this context?
Yeah, this is the beauty of being in the artistic position rather than the academic position. Yeah, I didn't say it wrong. What we meant by real, I guess that Tom example is a really good one, where the version where we quantized it was no longer kind of representative of Tom's playing or his sense of timing. So it's trying to make sure that we capture something that sounds very arty, but essentially real rather than definitively real. So we have no problem aesthetically chopping anything up, but if we play something back to the musician and they aren't, it doesn't represent them, then we don't ever use it. So it's kind of trying to find that line where we're representing them in a way they want to be, but it's nothing to do with, I guess we don't have a hard and fast rule of what is allowed to be real or not. So it's a very subjective view of what is real.
Yeah. So you kind of, it's up to the musician to decide.
Musician, that's, yeah.
And,
I guess
and
it's
you
trying to represent
yeah.
that, yeah. Take that improvisation and do something with it that embellishes it rather than just removes it.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Shall I pass it on to
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Very interesting stuff. Lovely range, and lovely to see so much about production in a talk like this. I am wondering how you think about the identity that you give the samples that you're working with. In the logic that you showed us, you had things named snare, and obviously you come from a pop production standard, so I'm guessing you're using that template primarily. But in the choice of choosing this sample for then this role and then extrapolating on that, there's kind of that is one of the things that you're using in the sort of what affordances and what restrictions you're working with here. So can you say more about how you consider the naming of samples and then also, or like assigning samples an identity that they maybe didn't start with, and how that might relate to these objectives of preserving identity or identifiability through this process, so that people can hear something that they can recognize, hopefully, in what you've created.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I took it out. We used to have this kind of cycle of normative and experimental, and like it would kind of go around like that. And some things were just normative in what we do. So kicks are normally on 1 and snares are often on 3 because it just sounds good. And it's kind of going back to the music concrete point that we do take so much from the popular music and electronic field. We aren't trying to necessarily reinvent that aspect of it. So we do label really normatively. Sometimes with samples, I actually had to check the white shirted one that there weren't swear word labelings of tracks, because sometimes it's describing things in kind of exaggerated form. Because when the way we do it is we'll have a day, one of us will have a day where we spend with different softwares, putting things in, seeing what comes out. And as you go, you're just labeling them. So in those kind of things do end up really normative, which is interesting. So we'll go, okay, well, they all live in pads. We'll even say those are synths. So they're not synths, they're samplers, but we'll say synths, pads, beats, melodies. And so it ends up looking like a normal DAW session that a producer could get hold of and go, I can mix this. And there are some things that can go a bit in the middle of that. So for instance, that white shirted one, there are a lot of different types of percussion coming in and out, things like stretched, shrunken, but the actual naming of things and their identity is normally related to pretty normative structures, unless we're doing something really weird. And I've tried, apart from that one prepared piano, I've tried to not do some of the really weird ones today. Does that answer your question?
Well, so the part 2 is, how in that process are you thinking about the preservation of identifiability?
Right. So in terms of the instrument or the part specific, do you think?
The source. I mean, you
Source.
deal with different kinds of sources, so I don't want to tie you down. I'm sure the factors are different when you're thinking about the space versus this instrument or this performer.
So it's in the wider sense, each project is its own conversation we have. So for instance, the double bass record, we knew that we wanted to do more preserving than we'd done on the drum record. So the drum record, because it was just drums and we needed to create a whole sonic world, we went at it in terms of making new identities and new sounds. With the double bass, we were much more keen to preserve, because I couldn't think of an electronic or a double bass record that did that. And it was something we really wanted to kind of contribute by making that. So there aren't many synths on that double bass record. It's instead much more of an ambient tale of the double bass. So each one is its own conversation. So the identity shifts. With Matthew Bourne. With Matthew Bourne, his playing is so frenetic. Well, half of his playing sounds like a beautiful lake, and it's just so serene. You know, oh, this man is wonderful. And then the next one is like, this is a nightmare. And so we wanted to do the album in those 2 ways. So on the nice side, we didn't really touch. We created new ways to put our identity interacting with Matthew's. And then on the chaos side, we went for it in a way that was much more than the double bass. So I guess the answer is that we do it on a case by case. Obviously with the Minster and with the brewery and with the temple, it's a really different identity, because we're then kind of almost composing from scratch our form of reaction to that place. Thank you.
Okay, Ramil.
Great throwing
Thank
catch.
you. Thank you very much for a great talk and
Thank you.
fantastic music. It really appeals to my musical taste and interest, and it also very much corresponds to my interest in research. I've done much on experimental music, and also been interested in this working within a limited framework. But one of the things that have kept my interest in many years, and I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on that, is that, of course, as a producer, it's kind of, I guess it's this innovative and pleasurable challenge of working within a limited and conceptual framework. But I also think that listeners often find this defamiliarization and fragmentation, recycling, this exposure of technology and glitches, that they find it fascinating. And I wonder if you have reflected about why is it that people find it so interesting?
Yes,
yeah.
that's a great question. Again, I've reflected on why they found it so interesting, and I've also reflected on why they don't all find it more interesting. One of the things that's really interesting about doing this, so obviously when we're making something, we've got no idea about reception. You're always just guessing what's going to come back. And it's been really interesting for us releasing albums and getting various reviews and press to see how people describe it. And it's part of the problem with the project from a commercial point of view. It's really difficult to describe. It took me an hour here. On the front of an album in a little sticker, it's hard. So people often have described the albums naturally, and it's kind of no problem, but incorrectly, like saying this happened and this person performed like this. It's like that wasn't a performance, because there's no way they could know that. There's one where on one of the records they said this person's playing was amazingly timed, and it reflected their other work, but actually it was us programming those parts in, which is just part of the project. One of the things I'm fascinated by in terms of it is the thing I concluded with, which is for a listener, for a listener, does it add value knowing that it's from one source, or how does it add value? So one of the things sometimes is with undergraduates is playing this music and explaining it's from one source, and they just can't comprehend it at that level of training or whatever. And so for them, it takes on a value that's maybe not intrinsically musical, but is instead process-based, because it's something that's more difficult to understand or less normal to understand. But then what was a really good, nice example in the whole Minster last week was people attending who maybe wouldn't go to that kind of performance, but it was a free public festival, and those people experiencing those sounds in a place that they know really well and having a really different experience of being in that place because of those sounds, which was really nice. I don't know if I've answered your question at all.
Yes,
Is that?
absolutely, yeah.
I realised I was just talking about the Minster again. But yeah, the reception thing is really hard to know. And for us, it's really hard to know from a commercial point of view what people want. And which is why we can't worry about it too much. So with the double bass record, we knew we wanted something more intimate and more double bass-y, because the reviews, to an extent, because the reviews from other ones had said that these albums are at their best where they're at the most, where we're doing the least, which is a really great review. When they shut up, it's really good. So we decided to be much more passive with the double bass one to see how that would go, and we love it. So we were right to shut up. Thank you.
I've put myself on the list, so staying with the list now. You do have some control in the sense that you have a manifesto. So manifesto is not just an expression of a stance. It's also a way to actually guide listening, if you like. So I was wondering with the whole cathedral event, where it was clear that the audience was actually sort of walking around, immersing themselves. How did you share, or how do you share the manifesto? And in that particular case, how did you guide the audience?
That's a really good question that we only thought of 4 days before the performance. So we've been spending so long thinking about getting the speakers there, setting up all of this stuff. And then our designer, who I shouted out before, Ollie, went, people need to know what it is. Otherwise, it's just being in a church and hearing nice sounds. So he amazingly mocked up flyers for the entrance. So people were given this thing with the artwork of it, an expression of what this work was and what it was for. So in that instance, they had something in their hands to go around with. But we printed 1,000 of them and ended up that 4,000 people came across the whole night. So the last 3,000 people had no idea what was happening. But the first performance, loved it.
Right. David is next.
Thank you again. This isn't really a question, just as you were presenting your manifesto, just randomly two precedents that came to mind that I thought were interesting. So one is from the realm of more electronic music composition. A piece in the late 70s by Paul Lansky, who was a composer at Princeton. It's called Six Fantasies on a poem by Thomas Campion. And he followed your manifesto well, that single source, it was an actress, it was actually his wife, Hannah McKay, recording a spoken recitation of this 16th century poem by Thomas Campion or something. And that was the only source that he could use for the entire composition. And he used synthesis and really early kind of speech synthesis techniques. There were 6 movements. Each one was, on the one hand, so the other part of the manifesto of trying to be true to the source, that each one had to express something of the sonic affordances of the speech. So there would be one movement where extremely percussive, crunchy sounds that were all from a sort of deep dive analysis of the consonant sounds in the original recording, or another one that's very, very lyrical, harmonious, which is taken from the vowel spectrums and things like that. So each one having to be true to the original sound source, and at the same time also trying to be true to Thomas Campion's poem. And then the other example that came to mind was the Cirque du Soleil Beatles project with George and Giles Martin. My understanding that, after like 3 years of negotiations with all the different parties, that they were allowed to do anything that they wanted as long as the source material was original Beatles. They could mix and match from any recording session, any songs or things like that. And then they also had a sort of obligation that still had to have sort of essential essence of Beatleness to it. And in that case, in terms of the question of, does a single source matter, that there was, of course, a contractual aspect that it did. And there was also the financial and marketing aspect that on the one hand, to the audience, it wouldn't really have mattered if they had added sounds in, but the conceptual that as far as like all of this is original Beatles materials that's been remixed, that the source mattered in that case because it had an extra musical aspect to it. So just two random instances that came to mind that both seem to be very adherent to your manifesto.
Yeah, those are really nice examples. And the word I've avoided in this talk is kind of the authenticity word.
Yeah.
In terms of whether it's more authentic or less authentic. But I think the Beatles one is a good example where that's got to be part of the conversation, that they wanted to keep it authentic to the original.
Yeah.
Thank you.
David, we can do a back throw today. Not throw, just like
Do a throw.
Here you go. Man.
destroy my computer. Thank you. Thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. I was just wondering if anybody who's seen you speak about this before has approached you and been inspired by your manifesto and actually tried it themselves as well, and how that experience was for them, or whether you've even considered offering it as a challenge to other artists or producers.
To the first one, yes. I've also done it in educational scenarios in conservatoires, kind of going for a workshop, talking about it, and then they've got a day. I gave some students in Manchester, in the North of England, the stems for the drum album, and they did their own version of it, which was amazing. I was jealous. But yeah, it's one of those. It's such a simple manifesto, which is always also kind of the reason I'm slightly hesitant to talk about the manifesto itself so much, because like your examples, then there's a lot of examples from this that I missed out showing them all. But those that do it, I think it's a very rewarding creative practice, even if it's just a test or a little study in going, how much do I need? I am now in a stage this year and at the end of last year of doing new projects that aren't with this manifesto, and it's so much harder. Like, although I'm saying it's hard to kind of hand quantize all of these things, the very idea of starting to find a sound or an aesthetic is so much harder, like the Stravinsky quote, if you don't have a start point. So I'm now in this scenario of like, do I feel more like a sawtooth wave or a square wave? Whereas the nice thing about this project is at the start of each one, I think I said at the start, I don't know how it's going to sound at the end. So with the drum album, we'd agreed to do this album, and I had no idea what a drum album was going to sound like, because we did our research and listened to loads of different ones, but nothing that was just from drum kit. So the fun in it is kind of the hunt to see what you can do and see what that thing can become, rather than going, I know what I want to make. What tools do I need to make that thing?
And if I can ask a kind of follow-up or relate to the chat. Oh, no, you have a question? No? Okay. I was going to ask, because you mentioned how challenging it is, and there's some researchers here who have basically given up music making in their spare time because it's so hard to make everything work in life. So I was wondering if you don't mind answering it, like this kind of more personal, practical question, like how does this fit into your professor position? And do you work on this in your professional capacities, or is this all a side project, or how does that work in your time schedule?
This is a side project. So this is something that I do outside or occasionally as little parts of work, but it's not a part of what I do in the building. So it's just a kind of a labor of love. Hence why it took 16 months to make that album, because evenings. The double bass one was done during lockdown, so that was a year of late night Zooming after work. So it's a thing for after. Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Okay, Martin's computer's in the middle, so I'll just
Not quite.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Thoughts, comments? No? We can always continue by the coffee machine. It's a very lovely coffee machine. And indeed, you're going to be here for the rest of the week, right? So it's, I guess, Remy's the contact person. Is that right?
Remy's the contact person.
Yeah, or
I should have mentioned, sorry, during it, that I've got, I've collated samples from these projects, the percussion samples for this. If anyone wants them to use for personal use, you're very welcome to take them off myself, or I can pass them to Remy.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, for now, let's thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Was it impressive enough with the